Alright, everybody, good evening. My name is Benjamin, and today I decided, and this is for the Roanoke Valley Chess Club. Now, I've decided that because it's a world championship year in the chess world, and we're going to go through and throughout the year until we reach the end of all the matches, we're going to look at every world championship match and every world championship tournament that's been held, so we can see the evolution of chess throughout the almost 200 years that we've had world championship matches. Now, I know some people are going to say, you mean about 150-ish, right? And the answer to that is no. I actually do mean almost 200, because I think that picking just Wilhelm Steinitz and saying first world champion, that's ridiculous, okay? Because, let's be honest here, Paul Morphy was considered the best player in the world and the world champion by basically everyone. And that's because he played basically everyone of note in Europe, except for Staunton, who dodged Morphy at every opportunity. And, well, yeah. So I think excluding Morphy from being a world champion is ridiculous. And if we look before then, there were players who were considered the strongest in the world even before Morphy. Now, the first one who really proved it by playing other very strong players routinely actually was decided in the match that we're going to look at today. And that is the match we're going to be looking at today is what I would consider the first true world championship match, and the first one where a player actually was able to prove that they were the best in the world. And that is the match between Charles Le Bourdannais and Alexander MacDonnell, right? Now, when we get to it, we will talk about the never held but planned to be held, the never held match between Fischer and Karpov, and we'll talk about the final candidates match that led to that one. And some people will consider a world championship match, others don't. We'll at least look at the games from that match because it's important. It'll at least allow us to look at some games. And then the other thing is, when we get to the 90s, we're going to follow the Kasparov line because the FIDE is just wrong. Kasparov lost his world championship match lost the world championship to Vladimir Kramnik. He didn't abandon his title in the 90s. Anyone who says otherwise is ridiculous. Now, this match, the lead-up was kind of strange, but Le Bourdonnais was considered the world's best player at the time after he was able to prove that he was a better player than his mentor, his teacher, Alexandre Deschapelle, and he also had beaten some other strong players in matches in London. And MacDonnell was considered a rising star, a younger star, and definitely ready to challenge. Now, we look at the overall result. The first match, and I think most people consider these matches to really just be one big match, just broken up into smaller matches. The first part of this match was the largest, consisting of 25 games, and Le Bourdonnais won that handily, 16-5 with 4 draws. However, if we look at the rest of the matches, other than the fourth match, it was actually competitive. The fourth and fifth matches were definitely Le Bourdonnais just beating MacDonnell, but the rest of them were pretty competitive. Though the overall score definitely doesn't seem that competitive, or because the overall score of the 6 total matches was 45-27 with 13 draws. If we exclude that first match, which was really just MacDonnell not being experienced enough, well, it gets a lot more competitive because we're talking about 29-22 with 9 draws. Now, as you'll notice, as we get closer to the modern era, there's more and more draws. But anyway, I've given you enough background, and Le Bourdonnais was definitely the stronger player. Now, the only reason why I've included this game is because it's the first game of the first match. And actually, the first game of the first match was, well, we'll see. E4, E5. That's pretty fitting for the time. And there were actually queen-pawn games, and Le Bourdonnais was a lot more modern in his opening choices than MacDonnell was. From having reviewed the games, Le Bourdonnais definitely was number one, a stronger player, but he was also overly cautious. Their ending play, there's a lot to be desired there. And their defensive skills were not so great. Openings were also generally weak, but, they didn't have the benefit of having, the modern access to... Basically, they didn't have all the developments that we have nowadays. And as you can see, the center game. Now, okay, this can be used to transpose into name an opening, really. But I don't think this is the most accurate move to make because black can actually really just hold on to that pawn, especially if you turn it into a gambit instead of taking it. But this is kind of the humble origins of World Championship play. I'm not so sure I agree. By the way, I'm not sure I agree with Queen F6, but okay. It was played. Castles from Le Bourdonnais. I believe it was. I'm going to make sure that I've got the... Le Bourdonnais was white in this game. And he immediately starts attacking, but it's justifiable. So he's castled. Black is not. Queen is arguably misplaced, blocking in this knight. And obviously, development is poor. Doubled isolated pawns. White's development is pretty solid. It's not great, but we can imagine that White's going to be developing a lot more rapidly. Knight at h6, f4. I agree with the move. It's preparing e5. Very direct play back in those days. Exactly. That's what we like to see. Taking that pawn, hitting the bishop, which is a target of course. Moving the queen again. I'm not sure I agree with knight a3. I personally probably would have considered something along the lines of rook e1. But, moving the knight's not bad. It's developing. Knight b5 is going to be coming pretty soon, I think. Bishop d3, targeting the weak pawn on h7. Defending. Knight c4, picking up a tempo. That's not unreasonable. Knight f3, going back, you're targeting e5 here, and obviously, so this is actually nice. We see an intermediate move, and immediately, by the way, White has sacrificed a piece, but we're about to see in this position a nice little tactic. It's called the Desperado. And they're waiting for a train. Or we could be talking about a different thing. But in this case, white plays knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, then we give a check, then we take the bishop, and we've established material parity again. So I think black has maybe kind of gotten away with some poor play. And that white hasn't really capitalized on. And then we just get a really dry ending. And they agreed to a draw here. Yeah, so obviously that first game is pretty rough. Now we flip it to that one. So this is actually, if I remember correctly, this might be the first decisive game. Right? And again, we have Le Bourdonnais as white in this one. And we get an Italian game and a Gioco Pianissimo. This is actually still played today. D4 is a bit aggressive nowadays. Much more modern handling is played T3 and A4, castles, stuff like that. Play it a lot slower. But this is the 1800s. And I actually like what white did here. So let's look at this again. So firstly, black took, white retook, grew the center, and the bishop went back, and white decided to play the advantage, use that center, because it forces black to make a decision. Is he going to put the knight over here on the edge, or is he going to do as he did in the game and play it over to e5, and allow white to just completely dominate the center? Black's really going to be hard pressed to figure out how to develop this knight, because if he plays knight f6, the issue is that your big break of f5, which will undermine this entire center, that's no longer a thing. So white's got a sizable advantage here, I think. And that's just solely because he's got a big center that's really hard to break against while also achieving the other goals of your position. Because if you play knight f6, bishop d7, castles, you're going to have to move that knight in order to attack the center. Otherwise, you've got ideas of maybe bishop d7, c6, but it takes a long time to start working against it. And any way you cut it, you're going to be destroying your structure, your pawn structure, to destroy white's big center. And meanwhile, white's got pretty free development, can castle, and can probably start attacking that king that's in the center. And as we see, knight f6, bishop g5, that's the other downside. Castles, queen f3, white's maybe going for a bit more aggressive of a setup by castling long rather than short. But that's not what happened. Instead, white decided to go straight for an ending, which in this case actually preserves his big advantage, because it's going to be a lot harder for black to fight against that. Now, this is an interesting one. I'm not so sure I agree with it. But on the other hand, that pawn ist verboten. So, as we see, black didn't take it, but if we imagine that black does take it, rook here, if you try to defend with the pawn, well, that's not going to work. And if you defend with this one, h3 wins the bishop, and congratulations, that's a piece. So instead, king g7 was played, and again we've got the same problem with when white plays knight here, is that you can't take that pawn, and now that pawn is defended. We don't really have to worry about it. Rook defends both pawns. White castle's behind his center, and yeah. So pushing the pawn to disrupt the black position. Advances, defends the pawn. Bishop c5. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it was played. g6. Hey, if you're gonna let white, if you're gonna, I really like what white's doing here. Just, that's an advanced pawn. If you do nothing, like, well, black just did, congratulations. Now you've got the G file. F4, just as you do. I'm not sure I agree with it if the follow-up is rook g1. I would like to play something like e5, but that's not really doable. I think if you're going to play f4, you need to play rook e1 first. Otherwise, you're just giving up a pawn for I don't know what. And this is where I'm not so sure. I like bishop takes pawn here. Or f2, or bishop takes h2. Yeah, these games are generally not of the highest quality. Now, this is a good one. This is just a clearance sacrifice. And, of course, checkmate. Yeah, black just allowed that. That was almost a helpmate. The modern games are... The closer we get to the modern day, the better in quality the games are going to be. I believe this is the ultra famous game from this match. This is the one that it's not ultra high quality, but it's not terrible. So we have MacDonnell as white and Bourdannais as black. Yeah, okay, so this is this one. Okay, so we've got a Sicilian defense, which is, yeah, still played today. And we get a somewhat modern take. Nowadays, the theory is to play here, targeting d6, forcing d6 from black. Usually, afterwards, white can play c4. White can play a4, has been played. Knight c3 is a move. Realistically, there's a lot of things white can play that are pretty solid. Bishop c4 is a move. I play knight c3 in these positions, but, you know, there's a lot you can do. Instead, in the match, and this is proving that opening theories come a long way, MacDonnell just took that knight. He didn't like the tension, and I kind of agree. Well, that's the other thing, is his knight was attacked, he took the knight. But the problem is, this actually improves black's position a little bit, because now black arguably has greater control over the center than white does. Black is going to play d5 at some point, and maybe bishop b7, bishop c5, knight f6. He's going to get a nice position from it, while your knight's going to be limited in its ability. And in the Sicilian, these holes on d5 and d6 are really nice for white if you can actually exploit them, which you're not going to be able to in this situation. So I don't like taking the knight, but it happened. Bishop c4, that's actually not a bad move. Though it does eventually allow black to pick up a tempo, but you can restrict this. Bishop g5, I think, given the choices that white has made, white's at least trying to play logically after that, but black is kind of reacting to what white's kind of reacting to what black is planning, rather than the other way around, where white wants to be in control of the game. Bishop e7, that's reasonable. Queen e2. d5. Alright, so I really like d5. I think d5 is the right move to play here. And there are some crazy complicated lines if white were to take this pawn. White didn't take the pawn in game, but I definitely think that black is superior in this position. You can absolutely take that. I wouldn't, but it's a bit of a risk. Surprised the check isn't what's favored, all things considered. But this is why I'm not sure why it doesn't like the check. Engine, if I recall, actually prefers this, followed by queen here, check, and king here. And I definitely prefer black, but it's not so easy, right? But that continuation did not happen. Instead, white kind of made a positional error, and I'm not so sure I agree with it. I personally consider taking with the g-pawn, because most of the time you castle short, and that g-file might be good. On the other hand, taking the bishop, taking bishop f6, it makes perfect sense. And the reason why you want to do this is you want to make it a little bit easier to take on d5, but it doesn't really help you out. Instead, it just makes it doesn't help you take on d5. Instead, it also makes it impossible for you to take on e5 when you exchange these pawns. So I would consider that an error. Bishop there, and then castles, perfectly reasonable. Castles, perfectly reasonable. And then a5. a5 is actually a really good move. And this is, showing that Le Bourdonnais, while not as good as a modern player would be, definitely understood ideas, positional ideas, strategic ideas a lot better than MacDonnell did. Now, chess was kind of, at that time, transitioning from the Philidor school of thought, where you play with your pawns, you develop your pieces behind your pawns. It's very static. It's, you try to win material and then convert to an ending where you have more material and you convert that ending, to the Romantic school where you move one or two pawns and then your pieces do the talking. And you want piece activity, you're trying to attack for move one. All these pawn moves that the positional school are making are just creating weaknesses all over the board, And the problem is, sometimes the more experienced player is just better. And this is one of those cases, because a4 is threatening to trap the bishop. So a5 does two things. It threatens a4, trapping the bishop. It threatens bishop to a6, which skewers queen to rook. And it also develops the rook without moving the rook. And what does white have in their position? Black's just better. Black took a pawn, white recaptured. Again, this doesn't really change the position, other than makes black even better, because that tension was at least doing something. Because if black ever took or advanced, it actually becomes a little bit harder for him to develop his game. Now, I believe this is a position where white made a massive, massive error. No, okay, not this position. Pretty reasonable, threatening take that pawn. So you play d4 and you have a good center, and it also helps your bishop get active on the long diagonal because now the skewer isn't a threat. And it allows you to maybe get your queen to one of these squares and threaten checkmate over here. c4, yeah, that's a pretty bad move because it just straight up blocks your own bishop. I don't really see the point. You're not really threatening en passant because that's just terrible. It loses the queen. So, no. Queen b6. Perfectly reasonable. Getting a piece out and taking advantage of white's horrible position. Okay, bishop c2. Bishop g7. Because some people may be wondering why queen here is bad and not played. Well, that's the answer, because you lose the queen. So instead, bishop b7, knight d2, and black played rook a to e8. Now, a more modern player might consider rook c8 or rook d8, but I like rook a to e8, but rook c8 is very appealing as a Sicilian player. Just because that's the file you always put your rook on, so that's why I like it. The reason why queen b2 wasn't played is actually kind of hilarious, because it's, well, queen here, you're threatening checkmate now that bishop is actually defended, and the queen's kind of not in a good area. I think you've got to play something like g6. Or I love this. I love the engine's like, yeah, take on a2, because that stops checkmate. Because it just straight up doesn't. So you'd be forced to make a weakness. And you're not really going to hold that pawn. Not without a lot of issues. So instead, you play rook a to e8. Queen here isn't as good. We'll look at what white played. White actually played knight to e4, which I don't think is actually bad. The reason this isn't so good is I think actually you play just e4 yourself, and you would lose material doing that. So you can't really make that threat. So knight e4 stops that. Bishop goes back to d8. Obviously, you don't want to weaken your structure around your king if white thinks he's attacking, which he's not, but white thinks he's attacking. Plus, white's going to start rolling these pawns. It's a very good plan. You've got a big center. Use it. c5, pretty good there. And obviously, you don't move this knight as white, because that would be checkmate. Obviously, here, bishop takes, and you're going to get checkmated, or you're going to have to make a weakness. f3. Now, I'm not a big fan of f3 in general. I'm not a big fan of f3 in general. And the reason why I'm not a big fan of f3 is because it just weakens this position. Now, obviously, there are exceptions, but In this case, it's just it's a bad move. What would I consider instead? Maybe king h1, but if we're trying to be serious and play credibly here, f4 isn't bad. Queen f3 is probably preferable, to be honest with you. At least it does something, but f3 was played. Bishop e7. Now, I'm not so sure. I would have probably played f5 here. But the reason for bishop to e7 is to hit that pawn and try to dislodge the knight, as well as just give the rook some mobility on the back rank. Rook c1. Now you're running into some problems if you do take that pawn. So f5 now. And I do actually think f5 is the best move. It's the most logical, at least. Queen check. And at the end of the day, yes, white does get play on that file, but it's not really that dangerous. Bishop to a4, and the queen goes to h6. And yeah, okay, so you do give up the exchange. Now, the reason you don't want to take that bishop is because actually the center's better. And that knight is a little bit more important of a piece than that bishop. c6. You take that pawn, and you actually can't take the bishop here. And I'm going to put that on the board. So I'm going to give the audience a little bit of a chance to see why. Okay, so the correct move is here, and it doesn't actually matter where you go. I think this holds on a little bit longer, followed by that, followed actually by rook here. King doesn't matter where you go. We can play any discovered check works. And that's mate. And instead, if the king goes here, that's check, and it leads to checkmate. So that's actually why you can't take the bishop. And the bishop wasn't taken. Instead, white defended along the second rank. Black still checked. And then he played bishop to c8. Always retreat. And Bourdannais is a Frenchman, so jokes write themselves. Obviously trying to save material here. White is up in exchange, but black's got a much better position. Obviously, push that pawn. It's a passer now, and it's ready to promote. And obviously, the big threat in this exact position, if you play, say, as white, play bishop here, well, oops. I'm sorry, what? White plays there. And takes that. And, well, material's equal, but you could not pay me enough to... yeah, and now we're just... Black's just up a rook, and you can't convince me this is playable. So instead, rook f1 was chosen. Hey, one pawn on the 7th was good. Why don't we go for another one? Oh, and actually, first we're going to take that bishop. And the reason why we take that bishop is the pawn is a lot worse on the d file than it is on the c file. And obviously, you can't quite push just yet. You got to do something else first. You got to defend the pawn. obviously, we're not going to take that queen. That's just ridiculous. You just play bishop d8, and white doesn't promote. Queen f1, or queen e1, obvious move should be obvious, and there's your pawn on the 7th. And here, white is just trying to desperately hold on. Queen c5, hitting the rook, which just goes into the corner. No need to be fancy. E2, e3, and so this is the most accurate move. I think everything wins. But like I said, it's the most accurate, so we're going to play it. And it also, I think this is pretty. This is just beautiful. And white resigned here, which is very rare in those days. Most of the time, they played till mate or till the advantage was obscene. But I do like that the idea was actually allowed to finish. That's something I like from back then, is they allowed the finish to be obvious if they resigned. You know, in this case, it's resignable. It was resignable a few moves ago, I think. But allowing the idea to be put up there, oh, that's a beautiful final position. So we will move on to the next game, which was another. I'm actually gonna. Bourdannais is white. Oh, yeah, so, believe it or not, the Queen's Gambit actually got played a handful of times in the match. And we got to see a game with an isolated queen pawn, which, oh boy. These games were not ideal. These games were pretty bad. Moving on, this is another Bourdannais Queen Gambit. And again, another IQP. And this one actually wound up being an endgame. And straight up a blunder. But, you know. Now, that's not to say that MacDonnell was a pushover. Like I said, MacDonnell actually won some games. For example, this one, which, again, it's a bit low quality. And actually, I think Bourdannais has a much better position for most of this game. I don't even think it's a contest. I much prefer Bourdannais' position. And I much prefer what he's doing here with the white pieces. He's playing it, honestly, close to how a modern player might play it. I mean, shoot. MacDonnell is having to sack and exchange as defensive measure, and it still doesn't really help him. And then, of course, white sacks a piece, and then a pawn, and he's got a just devastating position. How is black supposed to defend? I mean, okay, rook there, and then, yeah, this is just terrifyingly bad. And then Bourdannais didn't even attempt to play this correctly. So let's actually go back here and try and find the correct way to win this game. So obviously takes is correct. King goes there. And then queen there. Bishop goes back. which this is, I think, this is kind of the error of the position, right? Is allowing the check. I think Le Bourdonnais maybe was playing too cautiously on the attack. I think that's fine. And after that, so what's the correct way to play this? I almost wonder if just simple as just taking the knight. No? Okay. Computer actually likes the pawn move. Likes that. I assume because I almost wonder if king here is better. Okay. And material it's complicated, but I sort of like, I kind of actually like black here, but white's not getting crushed. But computer didn't necessarily hate this, but it definitely agrees this is better, so. I assume that's... Wow, engine doesn't actually like that. What does it say the best move is? Knight takes. Oops. Oof. And I prefer black ever so slightly, though this is probably going to be a draw. King A1, bishop takes E4. Now let's see if I can figure out what the correct move is. It's not taking that. Okay, so Le Bourdonnais did play it correct. Yeah, that's correct. Queen G3, was that the correct move? No, Queen... What is the difference on Queen G4? Ah, Queen E3. Because now the bishop, when it goes here... See, that's a mistake. Queen E3 is just far superior. And what's the actual defensive resource here? Oops. New variation. Okay. Wow. Now this is crazy. And I think black's just better. But in the game, Queen G3 was played. Bishop there, and then, like I said, this was just poor defense. But it is pretty funny that in the first World Championship match we had an under promotion. Now, if we move on to a game that I'm not going to say it was played well, but a game that was played better. Oh, whoops. No, don't save it. If we move on to a game that was played better, white, again, MacDonnell has the white pieces, Bourdannais has the black. It's a King's Gambit. And actually, this is one of the novelties, opening theoretical nuances that actually came from this match, along with Queen Pawn being a playable opening, as well as the Sicilian being an opening. And, okay, it's the 1800s. We're going to be seeing these types of King's Gambits. Now, this is actually called the MacDonnell Gambit. So, let me flex my King's Gambit knowledge. So, this is the very main lines, and sometimes it leads to, I want to say it's the Kizaretsky, which is, that's ultra main line. This leads to Muzio Gambit territory. This is actually a modern take and recommended by Scottish Grandmaster John Shaw in his book, which I've got. He also sometimes recommends this, though it's more of a very, I think it's after this and D6. He likes the idea of throwing in G3 at some point. This is the Rosentreader, and a pretty normal line in the Rosentreader goes here, 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 takes equals queen, and here. And actually, I think white's just far better. What does it actually recommend? Because I think the only move is knight c3. I'm going to have to do some research. Interesting. But that was not played in. Instead, bishop c4 was chosen, and we get the MacDonnell Gambit. This is the famous Muzio Gambit. I'd actually argue that the MacDonnell might be slightly more accurate. And this is pretty standard territory for these types of gambits. And then, obviously, you play bishop f7 when the time is right, and you get a surprisingly devastating attack. Now, I disagree with black trading, but it kind of does make some sense. The reason I disagree with it is because of just how dangerous it is. Now, I kind of don't like that move. It's kind of hard for me to suggest a move otherwise, but at the same time, black's in danger. And king h1, just very nice. And the dynamics of this position are just very, very nice. And actually, black is completely busted here. I think the best move might be, well, they're all terrible. Because if you go to the F file, one of these two squares, you've got discovery. You've got the discovered check of knight here winning the queen, and your position is also, you're probably also being checkmated. So it's hard to recommend that. And if you go to this one of these two squares, either e7 or d8, the problem is if you go to e7, It actually doesn't really matter. You're losing the queen anyway, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, your position is really bad. So that's kind of a short little look at the very first World Championship match. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you all next time. Take it easy. Have a very nice day. Bye-bye.